the battle that was fought after the war ended. The Battle of Palmito Ranch stands as one of history's most peculiar military engagements, a clash that occurred more than a month after the Civil War had officially concluded. On May 13, 1865, while most of the nation was beginning the long process of healing, Union and Confederate forces clashed along the banks of the Rio Grande in the southernmost tip of Texas, completely unaware that General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. This final battle erupted when Union Colonel Theodore H. Barrett, commanding forces at Brazos Santiago Island near present-day South Padre Island, ordered an advance toward Brownsville. Historians debate Barrett's motivations. Some suggest he was an ambitious officer with no combat experience desperately seeking glory before the war's complete end, while others propose he was concerned about reports of Confederate cotton being smuggled into Mexico to avoid Union confiscation. The Union force of about 800 men, including the 60 Cindy U.S. Colored Infantry and the 2nd Texas Cavalry, pushed inland and initially encountered little resistance. They captured a small Confederate outpost at White's Ranch and proceeded toward Palmito Ranch. However, Confederate Colonel John Rippey Ford, commanding about 300 men, rallied his forces and launched a fierce counterattack, bolstered by French artillery support from across the border in Mexico. The French forces under Emperor Maximilian had established friendly relations with the Confederacy, creating an unusual international dimension to this final battle. The ensuing engagement stretched over 2 days, with the tide eventually turning against the Union forces. Ford's Confederates pushed the Union troops back in disarray, resulting in approximately 30 Union casualties and capturing more than 100 prisoners. In a strange twist of fate, the very last soldier killed in combat during the Civil War was likely Private John J. Williams of the 34th Indiana, a 23-year-old farmer who had survived the entire war only to die in its meaningless final battle. The battle's outcome, a Confederate victory, stands as one of history's great ironies. Those celebrating their triumph had no idea the cause they fought for had already been lost. When news of Lee's surrender finally reached the Rio de Valley weeks later, Confederate forces, they surrendered on May 26, 1865. Colonel Ford reportedly told his troops, "Boys, we have done finely. We will let well enough alone and retire." The delay in communication that led to this unnecessary bloodshed highlights the technological limitations of the era. While telegraph lines connected much of the country, the remote Texas-Mexico border remained isolated, dependent on messengers traveling by horseback or ship. Messages that took mere hours to reach Washington from Richmond could take weeks to arrive at the nation's far-flung frontiers. Palmito Ranch has another distinction. It was one of the most ethnically diverse battlefields of the Civil War. The Union forces included African-American troops of the 60 Cindy U.S. Colored Infantry, while the Confederate side included Tejano, Hispanic, Texan cavalry units and indigenous scouts. This multicultural aspect of the battle reflects the complex demographics of the borderlands region. Today, the Palmito Ranch battlefield is a National Historic Landmark. Preserved as a reminder of this strange historical footnote, the site remains largely undeveloped, looking much as it did in 1865, with coastal prairies stretching to the horizon. Archaeological studies have uncovered mini balls, uniform buttons, and other artifacts that tell the story of this final, futile engagement. The battle has inspired numerous works of historical fiction and continues to fascinate Civil War historians as an example of the war's chaotic conclusion. It serves as a poignant reminder that wars rarely end cleanly or completely on the day peace is declared. For the men who fought and died at Palmito Ranch, the war ended not with Lee's surrender, but with their last breath on a remote Texas battlefield, fighting for a cause that had already been decided. The Civil War had hot air balloons in the annals of military innovation. Few developments were as visually striking or conceptually forward, thinking as the Union Army's Balloon Corps, a pioneering aerial reconnaissance unit that brought the ancient dream of flight into the deadly serious business of modern warfare. This unlikely military unit, officially established in 1861, represented the world's first organized air force and laid the groundwork for military aviation that would revolutionize warfare in subsequent centuries. The corps was the brainchild of Professor Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe, a self-educated scientist and accomplished aeronaut who had already made a name for himself with spectacular balloon flights before the war. In April 1861, Lowe conducted a dramatic demonstration for President Abraham Lincoln, ascending in his balloon, Enterprise, while tethered to the White House grounds. From 500 feet above Washington, Lowe sent the first aerial telegraph message in history to Lincoln, proving the potential military value of his innovation. Impressed, Lincoln authorized the creation of the Balloon Corps under the command of the Army's topographical engineers. The corps eventually grew to include 7 balloons ranging from the small 15,000 cubic foot Eagle to the massive 32,000 cubic foot Intrepid. Each silk balloon was hand-sewn and coated varnished with highly flammable hydrogen gas that provided lift. Creating the hydrogen itself was a dangerous and laborious process involving iron filings and sulfuric acid in horse-drawn generators. The entire operation required specialized wagons, portable gas generators, acid tanks, and teams of trained men just to get the balloons airborne. Once aloft, typically at heights of 500 to 1,000 feet, aeronauts used field glasses to observe enemy positions, troop movements, and fortifications, transmitting their findings to ground commanders via telegraph wires that ran along the tether ropes. This real-time intelligence gathering represented a revolutionary advantage in an era when battlefield commanders typically relied on cavalry scouts or simply climbed the nearest hill to gain perspective on enemy positions. The balloons proved immediately valuable in several early campaigns. During the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, Lowe's observations from above Harrison's Landing helped General George McClellan position his artillery with unprecedented precision. At the Battle of Fair Oaks, Lowe ascended 7 times in a single day to monitor Confederate movements, helping to prevent a potential Union disaster. Confederate General James Longstreet later admitted that the presence of Union eyes in the sky forced Confederate troops to camouflage their movements and disrupted their ability to concentrate forces effectively. The Confederate Army, recognizing the advantage the Union gained from its aerial observations, attempted to create its own balloon corps. Lacking the industrial capacity to produce silk and facing Union naval blockades that prevented the import of materials, Southern aeronauts improvised by creating balloons from assembled dress silks and even cotton-coated with varnish. The most famous Confederate balloon, the silk dress balloon, was allegedly made from donated dresses of Richmond society ladies, though historians now doubt this romantic tale. These Confederate balloons saw limited service around Richmond in 1862, but were eventually captured or destroyed. Despite their tactical success, the Balloon Corps faced persistent institutional challenges. Traditional military officers viewed the civilian aeronauts with suspicion and often ignored their intelligence reports. Logistical difficulties abounded. Moving the bulky equipment through muddy roads and rugged terrain proved nightmare-inducing for quartermasters. The balloons themselves were vulnerable to changing weather conditions, with sudden winds sometimes sending observers on wild, unplanned journeys. Ironically, the Corps' greatest challenge came not from Confederate bullets, but from Army bureaucracy. When the Balloon Corps was transferred from the command of the forward-thinking topographical engineers to the more conservative Corps of Engineers, Lowe found himself buried in paperwork, his pay reduced and his requisitions denied. Frustrated, he resigned in May 1863. Without its visionary leader, the Corps quickly disbanded, and its remaining balloons were sold off or put in storage. The Balloon Corps' brief existence left a lasting legacy. It demonstrated the strategic value of aerial reconnaissance that would later be fulfilled by aircraft and satellites. The systems developed communication between air and ground laid the groundwork for modern air-to-ground coordination. Even the observation techniques pioneered by Lowe's aeronauts would be adopted and refined by future generations of military aviators. Today, a monument to the Union Balloon Corps stands near the spot where Lowe made his first military ascent at Falls Church, Virginia, a testament to these daring pioneers who took to the skies long before aircraft dominated the battlefield, introducing the vertical dimension to American warfare. Women fought in disguise and got away with it. When the cannons of Fort Sumter announced the beginning of the American Civil War in April 1861, few could have imagined that among the hundreds of thousands who would answer the call to arms were hundreds of women who would serve not as nurses or camp followers, but as combat soldiers on the front lines. Their remarkable stories represent one of the war's most carefully hidden chapters. a daring subversion of Victorian gender norms that allowed determined women to fight alongside men, often undetected for months or even years. Historical records have confirmed at least 400 cases of women who disguised themselves as men to fight in the war, though historians estimate the true number may have exceeded 1,000. Their motivations were as diverse as the women themselves. Some, like Sarah Emma Edmonds, who fought as Franklin Thompson with the St. Michigan Infantry, were driven by patriotic fervor. Others, like Jenny Hodges Elias Albert Cashier of the 95th Illinois Infantry, saw military service as an escape from the limited opportunities available to women. Many enlisted to remain close to husbands, fiancés, or brothers, unwilling to be separated from their loved ones even by war. The disguise process required careful planning and constant vigilance. Women bound their breasts tightly with cloth strips, cut their hair short in military fashion, and practiced male mannerisms, learning to spit, swear, walk, and talk like the men around them. Most chose regiments from areas far from their hometowns to avoid recognition. Many selected artillery or cavalry units where baggy uniforms and private bathing conditions made detection less likely. The women typically claimed to be teenage boys, allowing their smooth skin and higher voices to seem normal rather than suspicious. The chaotic nature of Civil War armies inadvertently aided these women soldiers. Medical examinations for recruits were often cursory at best, particularly as the war progressed and the need for bodies on the battlefield overcame concerns about physical fitness. A quick glance at hands and teeth, coupled with a question about general health, frequently constituted the entire medical screening. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of army camps, soldiers rarely undressed completely and bathed infrequently, providing further cover for women concealing their identities. These female soldiers didn't merely serve in support roles. They fought in some of the war's bloodiest engagements. Sarah Rosetta Wakemans Elias Lyons Wakeman saw action with the 353rd New York Infantry at the Battle of Pleasant Hill during the Red River Campaign. Francis Clayton, who enlisted as Jack Williams, fought at Shiloh and was wounded at the Battle of Stones River. Mary Seabury served for 18 months and fought in the battles of Fredericksburg and Antietam before her gender was discovered. Their combat performance was often exemplary, with some earning promotions to non-commissioned officer ranks based on courage and leadership abilities. The discovery of a woman's true identity typically occurred only through serious injury or illness that required medical attention. When Frances Hook wounded at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, doctors treating her gunshot wound were shocked to discover her gender. Similarly, Mary Galloway's identity was revealed only after she was severely wounded at the Battle of Antietam. Loretta Janetta Velasquez, who fought as Lieutenant Harry Buford, was discovered after being wounded at the First Battle of Bull Run, but later re-enlisted with another unit. Not all discoveries resulted in dismissal. Some regimental commanders, impressed by the women's demonstrated courage and unwilling to lose effective soldiers, quietly allowed them to continue serving. Others were discharged for good of the service, with their secret kept relatively quiet to avoid embarrassment to the military. A few women, once discovered, transitioned to roles as nurses or vivendi res women who served as sutlers and sometimes informal nurses, remaining with their regiments in a non-combat capacity. Perhaps most remarkable is that some female soldiers completed their entire term of service without detection. Jenny Hodges served for 3 years as Albert Cashier, fighting in over 40 battles and skirmishes. After the war, she continued living as a man for another 5 decades until a car accident in 1911 led to the discovery of her biological sex. By then, she was an elderly resident of the Illinois Soldiers' and Sailors' Home. Her former comrades, when informed of her true gender, rallied to her defense, testifying to her courage under fire and ensuring she retained her military pension. The post-war fate of many female soldiers reflects the challenging readjustment all veterans faced. Some, like Hodges, maintained their male identities, finding the freedoms and economic opportunities available to men preferable to the restrictions placed on women. Others resumed female identities but struggled to readapt to feminine roles after experiencing the camaraderie and relative equality of military life. A few capitalized on their unusual experiences by publishing memoirs, though these often met with skepticism from a society unwilling to believe women capable of such martial service. Recognition of these women's contributions came slowly, For decades, their stories were dismissed as tall tales or propaganda. Only in recent years, through careful examination of military records, pension files, medical reports, and personal papers, have historians confirmed the extent of female participation in combat roles. Their service represents not just a footnote to Civil War history, but a powerful testimony to women's determination to participate in the national struggle despite powerful social barriers designed to exclude them from the public sphere. Today, monuments at Gettysburg and other battlefields are beginning to acknowledge these hidden heroines who fought not only against the enemy, but against the gender constraints of their era. Pioneers who demonstrated that courage, patriotism, and military aptitude knew no gender boundaries long before women were officially welcomed into America's armed forces. A general's corpse took a 1,000-mile tour. When Major General John Sedgwick was killed by a Confederate sharpshooter at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 9, 1864, no one could have predicted that his death would launch him on a macabre journey across the war-torn nation. Sedgwick, commanding the 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, had been one of the Union's most beloved leaders, a figure so respected that even Confederate soldiers expressed regret upon learning of his demise. His final words became legendary in military lore. While chiding his men for ducking from distant sniper fire, he reportedly scoffed, "Thee couldn't hit an elephant at this distance," moments before a bullet struck him beneath his left eye, killing him instantly. The general's death created an immediate logistical challenge. In the mid-19th century, before modern refrigeration and transportation, the bodies of fallen soldiers typically received hasty battlefield burials near where they fell. Officers might merit wooden coffins, but common soldiers often went into the ground wrapped only in blankets. The hot Virginia spring weather meant that decomposition would begin within hours. Yet Sedgwick was no ordinary officer. As one of the highest-ranking Union casualties of the war and a man deeply admired by President Lincoln, his remains demanded special treatment. Enter Thomas Holmes, a pioneering embalmer who'd revolutionized the nascent field of mortuary science. Holmes had patented an arterial embalming method that replaced blood with his preservative fluid, a solution containing arsenic, zinc chloride, and other chemicals that dramatically slowed decomposition. While working as an Army Medical Corps contract embalmer, Holmes had already preserved hundreds of Union officers for shipment home. For Sedgwick, he would employ his most advanced techniques. In a field hospital tent behind Union lines, Holmes performed the embalming procedure, draining Sedgwick's blood and injecting several gallons of his preservative solution. The general's body was then dressed in a fresh uniform, complete with insignia of rank and medals. His facial wound was meticulously repaired and concealed with wax and makeup. When finished, Sedgwick appeared almost lifelike, an appearance that would be maintained throughout the remarkable journey to come. The preserved remains were placed in an ornate metal coffin with a glass viewing plate over the face. Innovation Holmes had helped popularize. This coffin was then secured in a wooden shipping container lined with ice and charcoal for additional preservation during transport. With preparations complete, Sedgwick's posthumous tour of the nation began. The first stop was Washington, D.C., where the coffin was brought to the White House itself. President Lincoln, who had greatly respected Sedgwick's steady leadership and unpretentious manner, insisted on viewing the remains and paying personal respects. The coffin was then moved to the East Room, where government officials, military officers, and ordinary citizens filed past in a continuous procession for 2 days. The Washington Evening Star reported that thousands came to view the noble countenance of the fallen hero, a testament to Sedgwick's popularity. From Washington, the funeral cortege traveled by train to New York City, where Sedgwick's body lay in state at City Hall. The city's elite turned out in force, with the mayor and governor attending the public viewing. The New York Times marveled at the remarkable preservation of the general's features, noting that Kuhn might believe the general merely asleep rather than departed from this earth. This public display served multiple purposes. It honored a fallen hero, provided civilians with a tangible connection to the distant war, and subtly demonstrated the Union's ability to care for its fallen with dignity, an important morale consideration as the war's casualty lists grew ever longer. The journey continued northward to Sedgwick's native Connecticut, with stops in several cities along the way. Each stop featured military honors, public viewings, and sometimes funeral processions through city streets. Local newspapers announced viewing hours, and crowds gathered at train stations to watch the coffin's arrival and departure. In Hartford, the state capital, Sedgwick lay in state at the Capitol building, where the governor proclaimed a day of mourning. Contemporary accounts describe women placing flowers on the coffin and veterans of the general's former commands, standing at attention beside it, some openly weeping. The final destination was Cornwall Hollow, Connecticut, Sedgwick's hometown. There, after a journey of over 1,000 miles that had taken nearly 2 weeks, the general was finally laid to rest in the family plot on May 23, 1864. The funeral drew thousands of mourners from across New England, temporarily transforming the small rural community into the center of national attention. The service featured a military band, a firing squad offering a final salute, and eulogies from both military and political figures. Sedgwick was buried near his parents in a grave that would later be marked by an impressive monument featuring a bronze statue of the general atop a granite pedestal. Sedgwick's posthumous journey represented more than just an elaborate funeral for one man. It signified a profound shift in American attitudes toward death and remembrance during the Civil War. The conflict's unprecedented death toll, ultimately exceeding 750,000, forced a reconsideration of how the nation honored its fallen. Before the war, embalming had been rare in America. By war's end, it had become common practice for officers and wealthy civilians. Companies like Holmes had effectively demonstrated the practicality of preserving bodies for delayed burial and long-distance transport. The practice of public viewings of embalmed bodies also gained widespread acceptance during this period. When President Lincoln was assassinated the following year, his embalmed remains would undertake an even more extensive funeral tour, with public viewings in multiple cities, along a 1,700-mile route. These rituals helped communities process their collective grief and connected home front civilians to the war's sacrifices in a tangible, visceral way. Today, Sedgwick's grave in Cornwall remains a site of pilgrimage for Civil War enthusiasts, and his story is told at Spotsylvania battlefield where he fell. But perhaps his most lasting legacy lies in how his death and funeral journey helped transform American funeral practices, establishing traditions of embalming and public viewing that would become standard throughout the country by the war's end, customs that persist in American funeral culture to this day. The Union Army had a Camel Regiment in the scorching desert landscapes of the American Southwest. One of the Civil War's strangest military experiments unfolded, a saga involving exotic animals, foreign handlers, frontier legends, and military innovation that reads more like fiction than historical fact. Years before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the United States Army had initiated a remarkable program to incorporate camels into military service, creating what would eventually become known as the U.S. Camel. The origins of this unusual military unit can be traced to the 1850s, when then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, the same man who would later lead the Confederacy, championed the camel experiment. Davis had become convinced of the animal's potential military value after reading reports of their successful use by European armies in North Africa and the Middle East. With the vast arid territories recently acquired from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase, the Army faced significant logistical challenges supplying remote outposts across terrain where horses and mules frequently broke down. In 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000, equivalent to nearly $1 million today, for the purchase and importation of camels and dromedaries to be employed for military purposes. Navy Lieutenant David Dixon Porter was dispatched aboard the USS Supply to acquire suitable specimens. After consulting with experts in North Africa and the Middle East, Porter purchased 33 animals, a mixture of 1 humped dromedaries and 2 humped Bactrian camels, along with several experienced camel handlers from Turkey, Greece, and Egypt. When the unusual cargo arrived at Indianola, Texas, in May 1856, it created an immediate sensation. Local newspapers reported that horses panicked at the sight and smell of the exotic beasts. The camel's strange appearance, distinctive odor, and frightening vocalizations earned them immediate notoriety. Even more shocking to American observers was the animal's strength. Camel could carry 600 to 800 pounds of cargo, more than twice what a mule could manage. Furthermore, they could travel up to 3 days without water, a critical advantage in the arid southwest. The experiment showed such initial promise that a second shipment of 41 additional camels arrived in 1857. The expanded Camel Corps was stationed primarily at Camp Verde, Texas, under the command of Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale. Beale, a frontier explorer and former naval officer, became an enthusiastic advocate for military camel use. In 1857, he led the camels on their most famous expedition, a survey mission from Texas to California that demonstrated their exceptional desert capabilities. During this journey, the camels repeatedly outperformed horses and mules. They maintained steady progress across terrain that exhausted other pack animals, climbed rocky slopes that horses refused to attempt, and continued functioning efficiently despite limited water. When Beale filed his official report, he declared the experiment completely successful and advised the War Department to import 1,000 more camels. His recommendation might have been implemented had history taken a different course. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 derailed the camel experiment. As Union forces withdrew from Texas, Confederate troops seized Camp Verde and its resident camel herd. Initially, the Confederates attempted to maintain the Camel Corps for military applications. They used the animals to transport cotton to Mexican ports, carry mail between outposts, and haul salt from mines in Louisiana. However, the Confederate handlers lacked the specialized knowledge possessed by the original Middle Eastern camel drivers, most of whom had departed. One notable exception was Haji Ali, an Ottoman camel expert who had accompanied the original shipment. Nicknamed High Jolly by Americans who struggled with his name, he remained with some of the camels that had been transferred to California before the war began. Working with Union forces, High Jolly continued to demonstrate the animal's military potential in desert conditions, though on a much reduced scale from what had been envisioned. As the war progressed, the practical difficulties of maintaining an exotic animal corps amid the larger conflict proved overwhelming. Many camels were sold to circuses, mining companies, and private individuals. Others escaped or were released into the wild, establishing a feral population that would survive in remote areas of the Southwest for decades. Travelers in Arizona, New Mexico, and California reported camel sightings well into the early 20th century. The last verified sighting of a wild descendant of the U.S. Army camels occurred in 1941 in Texas. After all, several attempts were made to revive the Camel Corps concept. The most notable came from a young lieutenant named George Custer, who proposed using camels for operations against Native Americans in the Southwest. His suggestion was rejected, and the Army increasingly focused on developing railroads rather than alternative pack animals to solve its logistical challenges. The strange saga of the military camels gained legendary status in the American West. High Jolly became a frontier celebrity, eventually settling in Arizona, where he lived until 1902. Today, a pyramid-shaped monument in Quartzsite commemorates his life and the camel experiment. Similarly, at Camp Verde, Texas, a historical marker tells the story of the Camel Corps headquarters. Military historians now view the camel experiment as a visionary program that fell victim to unfortunate timing. Had the Civil War not intervened, American military logistics might have developed quite differently in the Western territories. The camel's proven effectiveness in desert environments represented a potential solution to supply problems that would continue to challenge military planners for decades. The brief, strange history of American military camels remains one of the Civil War's most unusual footnotes, a reminder that innovation often appears in unexpected forms, and that even the most promising military experiments can fall victim to the larger forces of history. Generals had their own personal battle songs. In an era before electronic mass media, when radio, television, and recording technology remained decades in the future, music served as one of the most powerful forms of popular communication and cultural expression. During the Civil War, this musical tradition reached unprecedented heights, with songs functioning not just as entertainment but as propaganda tools, morale boosters, and even as vectors for transmitting military information. Among the most distinctive musical phenomena of the conflict was the creation of personalized battle songs for popular generals, musical tributes that transformed military leaders into folkloric heroes and provided emotional anchors for troops facing the horrors of combat. These songs, typically set to existing popular melodies, but with new lyrics celebrating a specific commander's exploits, spread through armies with remarkable speed. They were sung around campfires, during marches, and even sometimes during combat itself. The songs not only boosted morale but helped create distinctive identities for different fighting units, fostering esprit de corps and loyalty to particular commanders. For soldiers far from home, facing death and privation, these musical tributes to their leaders provided psychological comfort and a sense of purpose. Perhaps the most famous of these musical tributes was Sheridan's Ride, celebrating Union General Philip Sheridan's dramatic 20-mile gallop from Winchester to rally his retreating troops at the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864. The incident itself was already the stuff of legend. Sheridan, returning from a conference in Washington, heard the sounds of battle from miles away, mounted his warhorse Rinsey, and rode furiously to the battlefield, rallying fleeing soldiers along the way. By the time he arrived, his mere presence transformed a potential defeat into a decisive victory. Within days of the battle, poet Thomas Buchanan Read had composed a poem celebrating the ride. Set to music shortly thereafter, Sheridan's Ride became an immediate sensation in the North. The song's rousing chorus painted Sheridan as a mythic hero. "Hurrah, hurrah for Sheridan! Hurrah, hurrah for horse and man!" And when their statues are placed on high, under the dome of the Union sky, the American soldier's temple of fame, there with the glorious general's name, be it said, in letters both bold and bright, "Here is the steed that saved the day by carrying Sheridan into the fight." From Winchester, 20 miles away, Union bands played the song at military reviews, civilians sang it at patriotic gatherings, and Sheridan's troops adopted it as their unofficial anthem. The song proved so enduring that Sheridan's horse Rinsey became a celebrity in his own right. After the war, the horse was renamed Winchester in honor of the famous ride and eventually stuffed and displayed at the Smithsonian Institution, where he remains today. On the Confederate side, Thomas Stonewall Jackson inspired perhaps the most beloved general's song of the Southern cause. Stonewall Jackson's Way, written by John Williamson Palmer and set to a traditional tune, captured the essence of Jackson's military genius and religious devotion. The lyrics celebrated Jackson's unpredictable tactics, swift marches, and prayerful nature. Silence, ground arms, kneel all, caps off, old blue lights going to pray, strangle the fool that dares to scoff attention, it's his way. Appealing from his native sod, inform a pauperist to God, lay bare thine arm, stretch forth thy rod. Men, that's Stonewall's way. The song spread through the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia after its first appearance in 1862, with soldiers adding verses to commemorate Jackson's subsequent victories. The nickname Old Blue Light, referenced in the song, referred to the intense gleam reportedly visible in Jackson's eyes during battle, a detail that added to his mystique among his men. After Jackson's death from pneumonia following wounds received at Chancellorsville in May 1863, the song took on elegiac qualities, becoming a memorial to the fallen commander. Other generals received similar musical tributes. Union General George B. McClellan, despite his mixed military record, inspired "McClellan is Our Man," reflecting his immense popularity among the rank and file of the Army of the Potomac. Confederate Cavalry Commander J.E.B. Stuart was celebrated in "Join the Cavalry," a song that captured his flamboyant personality and daring raids. Even lesser-known commanders often had songs composed in their honor by the men of their specific regiments or brigades. These songs served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They functioned as oral history, preserving and sometimes embellishing the exploits of military leaders. They helped transform complex military operations into comprehensible narratives that soldiers could understand and take pride in. Perhaps most importantly, they humanized the immense and often impersonal machinery of war, giving soldiers emotional connections to their leadership and cause. The general's songs also played a role in the broader propaganda efforts of both sides. Published as sheet music with elaborate patriotic cover illustrations, songs like Sheridan's Ride helped shape civilian perceptions of the war. These publications allowed families at home to feel connected to the exploits of the armies in the field. Professional musicians performed these songs in theaters and concert halls, while amateur musicians played them in parlors across the nation. The tradition of musical tributes to generals existed before the Civil War, with songs celebrating figures like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott during the Mexican-American War. However, the scale and emotional resonance of the practice reached unprecedented heights during the Civil War. The conflict's immense scope, combined with improving literacy rates and distribution networks, allowed military songs to spread more widely than ever before. After the war, many of these songs remained in the American musical repertoire, performed at veterans' reunions and patriotic celebrations. Some, like Sheridan's Ride, entered the standard repertoire of school songbooks, ensuring their transmission to new generations. Through these songs, Civil War generals maintained a place in popular memory long after the conflict ended. Their exploits preserved in musical form when many other aspects of the war began to fade from public memory. The songs became part of the cultural foundation upon which post-war reconciliation narratives were built, helping transform military leaders into shared national heroes rather than partisan figures. The phenomenon of personalized battle songs illuminates several important aspects of Civil War culture that might otherwise be overlooked. First, it highlights the intensely personal nature of military leadership during this period. Unlike modern warfare, where soldiers might rarely see high-ranking commanders, Civil War generals were often visible figures who led from the front. This visibility, combined with the smaller size of Civil War armies compared to those of later conflicts, created conditions where soldiers could develop personal attachments to their leaders, attachments that found expression in song. Second, these songs reveal the importance of charisma and personal magnetism in Civil War leadership. Generals who inspired songs tended to be those with distinctive personalities and leadership styles that captured the imagination. Robert E. Lee, despite his central importance to the Confederate cause, inspired fewer songs than the more colorful Jackson or Stuart. Similarly, the methodical Ulysses S. Grant generated fewer musical tributes than the dashing Sheridan or the flamboyant George Armstrong Custer. The musical tradition also highlights the importance of narrative in shaping Civil War memory. Songs typically focused on specific dramatic moments. Sheridan's Ride, Jackson's flanking march at Chancellorsville, Stuart's ride around McClellan's army, rather than the grinding day-to-day reality of military operations. This selectivity helped create a romanticized version of the war that would influence how later generations understood the conflict. Additionally, these songs illuminate the fluid boundary between military and civilian culture. During the Civil War era, many battle songs began as published in civilian newspapers, before being set to music and adopted by troops. Others originated among soldiers before being commercially published for civilian consumption. This cross-pollination created a shared cultural understanding of the war that transcended the divide between battlefield and home front. Sheet music publishers capitalized on the popularity of these songs, often rushing new editions into print following significant battles or military achievements. The cover illustrations became increasingly elaborate as the war progressed, featuring portraits of the generals, battle scenes, and patriotic symbols. These publications represented significant business opportunities. A popular song might sell thousands of copies, generating substantial profits for publishers and composers. Today, these musical artifacts provide historians with valuable insights into how contemporaries understood and processed the conflict. The lyrics reveal which aspects of a general's personality or achievements most resonated with soldiers and civilians. The popularity of particular songs offers clues about which commanders held the greatest emotional appeal. Even the musical structures themselves, whether songs used major or minor keys, martial or sentimental styles, reflect the emotional tenor of different phases of the war. Modern reenactors and Civil War musical groups continue to perform these generals' songs, keeping the tradition alive for contemporary audiences. Organizations like the 97th Regimental String Band and the SIN South Carolina String Band have recorded authentic versions of many generals' songs. While historians and musicologists continue to study the profound impact these musical tributes had on Civil War culture and memory. In an era before electronic media, when photography was still in its infancy and news traveled slowly, these songs helped create the first shared national narratives about the war's key figures. They represent some of America's earliest examples of popular media creating and reinforcing military mythology, a process that continues to shape how wars are understood and remembered to this day. A soldier survived a bullet to the head for decades. The story of Private Jacob Miller of the 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment stands as one of the most remarkable cases of survival in medical history, a testament to both human resilience and the primitive state of Civil War battlefield medicine. Miller's incredible journey began on September 19, 1863, during the opening day of the Battle of Chickamauga, when a Confederate mini-ball struck him directly in the forehead with such force that it should have killed him instantly. Instead, it began an extraordinary decades-long saga of survival with a bullet lodged in his skull. As Miller would later recount in his own words to the military order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, Simoelos, "When I was hit, it felt like a horse had kicked me in the head. I was knocked unconscious but soon came to and found myself behind a tree. I reached up and felt my wound, putting my fingers into my brain. The blood was spurting out and I thought I would bleed to death." Despite his catastrophic injury, Miller remained conscious and alert. The bullet had entered his forehead about an inch above his right eye, penetrated his frontal lobe, and lodged firmly in his skull. By all medical standards of the era, such a wound should have been immediately fatal. However, several factors contributed to his unlikely survival. The bullet's trajectory had somehow avoided severing major blood vessels while missing critical areas of the brain, responsible for essential functions. Additionally, the relatively low velocity of Civil War-era bullets compared to modern ammunition meant the projectile created less hydrostatic shock to surrounding tissue. In the chaos of battle, with medical resources overwhelmed by thousands of casualties, Miller received only the most rudimentary treatment. A field surgeon likely cleaned the wound superficially, applied a simple dressing, and moved on to the next wounded soldier, expecting Miller would not survive the night. No attempt was made to remove the bullet, a decision that inadvertently may have saved his life, as the bullet itself helped plug the wound and prevent catastrophic bleeding or infection. Astonishingly, Miller not only survived the immediate trauma but managed to navigate the battlefield under his own power to reach Union lines. He was eventually transported to a larger field hospital, where surgeons again opted against attempting to remove the bullet. Given the limited understanding of brain anatomy and the complete absence of modern surgical techniques such as antisepsis, anesthesia, or neuroimaging, any attempt to extract the bullet would almost certainly have killed him. Miller spent several months recovering in military hospitals before being discharged as medically unfit for service in 1864. Upon returning to his home in northern Indiana, local physicians examined his wound with fascination, but similarly concluded that attempting to remove the deeply embedded bullet presented greater risks than leaving it in place. The wound in his forehead never fully closed, creating a permanent aperture that led directly into his skull cavity. This persistent opening created extraordinary complications in Miller's daily life. As he described in his memoirs, "I could feel the air pressure change in my head when the weather shifted. When I bent over, I could feel and hear the bullet moving inside my skull. During the cold winter months, the metal would contract and give me the most excruciating headaches imaginable. Perhaps most disturbing were the persistent drainage issues. The wound would regularly discharge small amounts of brain fluid and pus, requiring Miller to keep it covered with gauze that needed changing several times daily. During particularly bad episodes, pieces of bone fragments would work their way out through the opening, accompanied by increased drainage and pain. These episodes would leave Miller bedridden for days or weeks at a time. Despite these challenges, Miller displayed remarkable resilience and determination to lead a productive life. He married in 1867, fathered 5 children, and worked as a farmer and later as a pension evaluator, helping other wounded veterans secure government benefits. Miller became something of a local celebrity, occasionally demonstrating for medical students and curious visitors how he could blow cigarette smoke out through the hole in his forehead, an alarming party trick that illustrated the direct connection between his wound and his sinus passages. The bullet's presence took a cumulative toll on Miller's health over the decades. He suffered from chronic headaches, occasional seizures, personality changes including uncharacteristic anger outbursts, and periods of confusion, symptoms recognizable today as traumatic brain injury effects. Despite these difficulties, 19th-century medical accounts describe him as remarkably functional considering the nature of his wound, noting that he retained normal intelligence and conversational abilities. After living with the bullet for nearly 31 years, Miller's condition deteriorated significantly in the summer of 1894. Recurring infections had gradually eroded more of his skull and brain tissue, and doctors finally determined the risk of leaving the bullet in place now outweighed the dangers of surgery. Using recently developed X-ray technology to precisely locate the projectile, surgeons at Chicago's Cook County Hospital performed a delicate operation to extract the bullet and several bone fragments. The surgery was deemed a technical success, but Miller's weakened condition and decades of infection left him vulnerable to complications. After a brief period of improvement, he developed meningitis, a common and frequently fatal complication of brain surgery in the pre-antibiotic era. Jacob Miller died on February 30, 1895, having survived nearly 32 years with a bullet in his brain. Miller's case was well documented in period medical journals, with his skull and the extracted bullet eventually donated to the Army Medical Museum, and now the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. His case helped advance understanding of brain injuries and the brain's remarkable adaptive capabilities. Modern neurologists studying Miller's medical records have suggested that the bullet's path primarily damaged his frontal lobe, an area where injuries, while serious, are more survivable than those to other brain regions. Today, Miller's story is frequently cited in medical literature as one of the most extraordinary cases of survival following a penetrating brain injury from the pre-modern medical era. His detailed personal accounts of living with such an injury provide rare first-person insights into traumatic brain injury effects that continue to inform medical understanding. Beyond its medical significance, Miller's story serves as a powerful metaphor for the enduring impact of the Civil War on its survivors. Just as Miller carried a physical remnant of the conflict within him for the rest of his life, the nation itself would carry the psychological and social wounds of the war for generations. His remarkable survival against overwhelming odds reflects the resilience of countless veterans who returned home forever changed yet determined to build lives and a reunified nation despite their wounds, both visible and invisible. Confederates had their own fake White House. When Jefferson Davis took the oath of office as President of the Confederate States of America on February 8, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederacy had yet to establish a permanent seat of government. By summer, however, military and political considerations had prompted the relocation of the Confederate capital to Richmond, Virginia, a bustling industrial city of approximately 38,000 people situated just 100 miles from Washington, D.C. This move necessitated an appropriate executive residence for the Confederate president, setting in motion the creation of what would become known as the White House of the Confederacy. The building selected for this purpose was far from a hasty or makeshift choice. The stately neoclassical mansion at 12th and Clay Streets had been constructed in 1818 for wealthy merchant John Brockenbrough and designed by Robert Mills, who would later become the first native-born American to train as an architect and would go on to design the Washington Monument. The three-story brick structure featured Doric columns, elaborate plasterwork, and a distinctive gray, painted exterior that distinguished it from its more famous counterpart in Washington. The city of Richmond purchased the mansion for $42,000, approximately $1.3 million in modern currency, and offered it to Davis as the official executive residence. Before the Davis family could move in, however, extensive renovations were required to transform the private home into a building suitable for governmental functions. The city allocated an additional $80,000 for improvements, including the installation of gas lighting, modernized plumbing, and an expanded kitchen wing to accommodate state dinners and receptions. When Jefferson and Varina Davis took residence in August 1861, they brought with them their 4 children, Margaret, Jefferson, Joseph, and William, 2 more children that family during the time in the Confederate White House. Varina Anna, nicknamed Winnie, born in 1864, and another son named William who died tragically in 1862 after falling from the mansion's east portico. This personal tragedy cast a pall over the household that even affairs of state could not dispel. Unlike the White House in Washington, the Confederate Executive Mansion served a dual function as both government headquarters and private residence. The first floor contained state rooms used for official receptions, cabinet meetings, and diplomatic functions. These included a formal parlor, state dining room, and Jefferson Davis's office, where he worked long hours managing the Confederate war effort. The second floor housed the family's private quarters, while the third floor and basement contained service areas and staff housing for the household's enslaved workers. The interior furnishings reflected the devices, attempt to project Confederate legitimacy and respectability through material display. Much of the furniture was purchased new from Richmond manufacturers, supplemented by pieces from the device's own collection, and items donated by wealthy Southern supporters. Varina Davis, acting as both First Lady and household manager, supervised the decoration in a fashionable Victorian style with heavy draperies, ornate carpets, and substantial mahogany furniture. Contemporary accounts describe the interior as elegant without being ostentatious, an important consideration given the Confederacy's wartime resource constraints. Despite its impressive appearance, life in the Confederate White House was far from comfortable or secure. As the war progressed and Union forces drew closer to Richmond, the mansion became increasingly vulnerable. After the 7 days battles in 1862 brought fighting to the very outskirts of Richmond, soldiers were stationed on the grounds, and basement rooms were converted to accommodate military telegraph operators maintaining communication with Confederate forces. The mansion's prominent position on a hillside made it visible from several vantage points around the city, raising concerns that it might become a target for Union artillery. Security concerns led to the installation of an alarm system, a series of bells connected to the mansion's exterior gates that would ring whenever someone entered the grounds. Jefferson Davis also carried a pistol at all times while in the residence, and armed guards maintained a constant presence. These precautions reflected not only general wartime security concerns, but also specific fears of Union covert operations targeting Confederate leadership. Daily life in the Confederate White House offered striking contrasts to its Washington counterpart. While Lincoln's White House maintained an open-door policy where ordinary citizens could approach the president with requests or grievances, access to Davis was strictly controlled, with multiple military aides screening visitors. This difference reflected both Davis's more formal governing style and the heightened security concerns of a government at war within its own territory. The Confederate White House never achieved the symbolic resonance among Southern citizens that the original White House held for Americans. Few ordinary Confederates ever saw the building except in illustrations, and its relatively short period of operation, less than 4 years, limited its ability to develop the cultural associations and traditions that defined its northern counterpart. Additionally, as wartime privations increased throughout the South, the relative comfort maintained in the executive mansion became a potential source of resentment rather than pride. The end came suddenly on April 2, 1865, when Union forces broke the Confederate defenses at Petersburg. Davis received news of the breakthrough during Sunday morning services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. He immediately returned to the executive mansion, where he oversaw the hurried packing of government documents and personal belongings. By evening, Davis and most Confederate government officials had boarded trains for Danville, Virginia, beginning the retreat that would end with Davis's capture in Georgia the following month. Union forces occupied Richmond on April 3, and President Lincoln visited the abandoned Confederate White House on April 4, sitting briefly at Jefferson Davis's desk in a powerful moment of symbolic reclamation. After the war, the building served as headquarters for military, District No. 1 during Reconstruction, before being converted into a public school known as Central School. In 1890, amid the rising Lost Cause mythology that romanticized the Confederacy, the Confederate Memorial Literary Society acquired the building and transformed it into the Confederate Museum, filled with artifacts and memorabilia celebrating Confederate military leaders and the Davis administration. This preservation effort likely saved the structure from demolition during Richmond's early 20th century urban development. Today, the building is known as the White House of the Confederacy and operates as a historic house museum administered by the American Civil War Museum, meticulously restored to its wartime appearance. It provides visitors with insights into both the domestic arrangements of the Davis family and the functioning of the Confederate executive branch. While its historical significance is undisputed, interpretive efforts now place greater emphasis on contextualizing the building within the broader history of the Civil War and slavery rather than venerating the Confederate cause. For historians, the building represents a physical manifestation of the Confederacy's attempt to establish itself as a legitimate nation through the creation of parallel governmental institutions and symbols. Its preservation offers a tangible connection to the complex and contradictory heritage of the Civil War era, a structure that embodied both the Confederacy's aspiration to nationhood and the fundamental moral failure of its foundation upon human bondage. The South had its own ironclad warship that was nearly unsinkable. In the early morning hours of March 8, 1862, lookouts aboard the wooden-hulled Union ships blockading Hampton Roads, Virginia, spotted an ominous silhouette emerging from the Elizabeth River. The strange vessel resembled nothing they had ever seen. Sinister sloped roof floating atop the waterline, belching black smoke with barely any deck visible. This was the CSS Virginia, the Confederacy's revolutionary ironclad warship, and its appearance was about to change naval warfare forever. The vessel approaching the Union fleet had begun its life as something quite different. Originally the USS Merrimac, a conventional gun-steam frigate commissioned in 1856, the ship had been burned to the waterline and scuttled by retreating Union forces when they abandoned the Norfolk Navy Yard in April 1861. Confederate engineers, led by naval constructor John Luke Porter and Lieutenant John Mercer Brooke, saw potential in the sunken hulk. In a remarkable feat of salvage engineering, they raised the charred remains and began an ambitious conversion project. The transformation was dramatic. The recovered hull was cut down to the berth deck, and a sloped casemate constructed of 24-inch thick pine and oak beams was built atop it. This wooden framework was then covered with 2 layers of 2-inch thick iron plating, with the plates overlapping to prevent seams that might be exploited by enemy fire. The iron came from railroad rails that had been melted down and rolled into plates at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, one of the few southern industrial facilities capable of such production. The ship's bow featured an iron ram, designed to puncture the wooden hulls of enemy vessels. Construction faced numerous challenges. The South's limited industrial capacity meant that many components had to be manufactured in makeshift facilities or salvaged from other sources. The ship's engines, recovered from the original Merrimac, were damaged by saltwater immersion and never worked properly. The iron plating, hastily produced with limited quality control, varied in strength and consistency. Labor shortages and material scarcity caused frequent delays. Nevertheless, after 9 months of round-the-clock work, the Virginia was commissioned into Confederate service on February 17, 1862. The completed vessel was an engineering compromise with significant limitations. Drawing 22 feet of water, it could operate only in deeper channels and risked running aground in the shallow waters of Hampton Roads. Its engines were underpowered, giving the ship a top speed of just 5 knots and making it cumbersome to maneuver. The pilot house, a small cast iron fixture near the bow, offered minimal visibility. Inside the casemate, conditions were nearly unbearable. Temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees, ventilation was poor, and the noise of battle within the iron chamber was deafening. Despite these drawbacks, the Virginia represented a revolutionary advancement in naval technology. Its iron armor made it effectively impervious to the standard naval ordnance of the era. When it steamed into Hampton Roads on that March morning under the command of Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan, it was about to demonstrate this invulnerability in dramatic fashion. The Virginia headed directly for the USS Cumberland, a 30-gun sailing frigate. As the Ironclad approached, the Cumberland opened fire with everything in her arsenal. Eyewitnesses reported watching in astonishment as heavy shot bounced harmlessly off the Virginia's sloped iron sides, like rubber balls. Some rounds that struck directly produced only dents or chipped the iron. The Virginia's own guns, meanwhile, fired with devastating effect into the wooden hull of the Cumberland before ramming the Union vessel below the waterline. The Cumberland began sinking rapidly but continued firing until the waters closed over her gun decks, taking 121 sailors down with her. The Virginia then turned its attention to the U.S. Congress, another wooden frigate. After an exchange of fire that left the Congress badly damaged and run aground, white flags appeared on the Union vessel. During the surrender proceedings, Union troops on shore opened fire on the Virginia, wounding Buchanan. Incensed by what he perceived as a violation of the white flag, Buchanan ordered hot shot fired into the Congress, setting the ship ablaze. The Congress burned throughout the night, eventually reaching her powder magazine and exploding spectacularly. By day's end, the Virginia had destroyed 2 major warships, damaged a third at the USS Minnesota. and killed over 240 Union sailors while losing only 2 men of her own. The seeming invincibility of the Ironclad sent shockwaves through the Union leadership. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton feared the Virginia might shell Washington itself. Some panicked officials began preparations to sink stone-laden barges in the Potomac to block the channel, while others urged the evacuation of federal money from the capital. However, the Virginia's reign of terror would be short-lived. The next morning, March 9, as the Ironclad steamed out to finish off the stranded Minnesota, it encountered the USS Monitor, the Union's own ironclad that had fortuitously arrived during the night, a revolutionary design by a Swedish engineer, John Ericsson. The Monitor featured a flat deck with a rotating turret housing 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns. The ensuing 4-hour battle, the first clash between ironclad warships in history, ended in a tactical draw, with neither vessel able to inflict decisive damage on the other. This historic engagement rendered wooden warships obsolete overnight and launched a new era in naval architecture. The international implications were immediate and profound. Britain and France, the world's leading naval powers, instantly recognized that their wooden fleets had become essentially worthless. The British Admiral Sir John Hay later remarked, "I do not exaggerate when I say that the day the first shot was fired from the ironclads at Hampton Roads was a more important day in the annals of naval warfare than any since cannon were first mounted on ships' sides." The Virginia's career after this famous battle was brief. When Norfolk fell to Union forces in May 1862, the Confederates attempted to lighten the ship to navigate up the James River to Richmond. When these efforts failed due to the vessel's deep draft, the decision was made to destroy it rather than allow capture. On May 11, 1862, the Virginia was deliberately blown up by its crew near Craney Island. The explosion was reportedly heard 10 miles away in Norfolk. Although short-lived, the CSS Virginia's impact on naval history was enormous. Its design innovations influenced Confederate naval construction for the remainder of the war, leading to the production of other ironclads like the CSS Atlanta, Tennessee, and Albemarle. More broadly, the Virginia Monitor engagement accelerated a global transition to armored warship construction that would continue for decades. Elements of the Virginia's sloped armor concept can be traced through later warship designs and even to modern tank armor. Today, artifacts from the Virginia are displayed at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, including the ship's anchor and sections of armor plate. The location where the Virginia was destroyed is marked as an archaeological site, though most of the wreckage was salvaged in the years following the war. While no complete photographs of the vessel exist, only artists' renderings and engineering drawings, its distinctive silhouette remains the most recognizable images of Civil War naval technology. The legendary status of the nearly unsinkable Confederate ironclad has only grown with time. Its brief career represents one of history's most dramatic examples of technological innovation, emerging from resource scarcity and military necessity, a Southern David that, for a brief moment, neutralized the naval Goliath of the industrialized North and changed the course of maritime history forever. The Confederacy accidentally attacked itself in one of its bloodiest battles. The Battle of Fredericksburg, fought December 11 to December 5, 1862, stands as one of the most lopsided Confederate victories of the Civil War. The engagement culminated in a disastrous Union assault against well-entrenched Confederate positions on Marye's Heights, where wave after wave of Federal troops were cut down in what General Lee described as a crime to send men to certain death against such a position. Yet amid this overwhelming tactical success, the Confederate forces experienced a little-known incident of friendly fire that nearly compromised their defensive advantage and caused unnecessary casualties among their own ranks. Tragic occurrence that would be downplayed in official reports but remembered vividly by the soldiers who experienced it. The incident occurred during the chaotic early morning hours of the December 10, 1862, as heavy fog blanketed the Rappahannock River Valley. After 2 days of urban combat in the streets of Fredericksburg, where Union forces had finally established a bridgehead after multiple failed crossing attempts, both armies prepared for what promised to be a decisive engagement. The Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee occupied a formidable 7-mile defensive line on the heights beyond the town, with Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps holding the northern portion of the line centered on Marye's Heights, and Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's corps positioned along the southern flank. The geographic features of the battlefield created natural zones of confusion. Several ravines and wooded areas intersected the Confederate line, particularly at the seam between Longstreet's and Jackson's corps, creating blind spots where visibility was limited even under optimal conditions. The morning fog, which reduced visibility to mere yards in some areas, exacerbated these challenges. Additionally, many Confederate units had been repositioned during the night to strengthen potential weak points, with some commanders not fully aware of exactly which friendly units occupied adjacent positions. The trouble began around 7:30 a.m. as Union artillery opened a massive bombardment, preceding their infantry assault. Confederate batteries responded in kind, creating a thunderous exchange that reverberated across the battlefield. Amid this artillery duel, pickets from the 13th South Carolina Infantry of Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg's brigade reported movement in the fog, shrouded woods to their front. Simultaneously, soldiers from the 14th Tennessee of Brigadier General William Archer's brigade, positioned nearby but at an oblique angle, noticed shadowy figures moving through the mist. What neither unit realized was that they were observing each other. Both brigades belonged to A.P. Hill's division of Jackson's corps, but had been positioned in slightly overlapping sectors during nighttime redeployments. Without clear visibility, and with the disorienting effect of the artillery bombardment, each unit misidentified the other as advancing Union troops attempting to probe the Confederate line for weaknesses. Colonel O.E. Edwards of the 13th South Carolina ordered his men to open fire on what he believed were Federal skirmishers. Almost simultaneously, Lieutenant Colonel J.W. Lockett of the 14th Tennessee gave a similar command. The result was devastating: Confederate troops firing directly into their own lines. The confusion was compounded when neighboring units, hearing the gunfire and assuming an enemy attack had begun, joined in without clear targets. Colonel D.H. Hamilton, commanding Gregg's brigade, rushed forward upon hearing the firing, but was unable to immediately assess the situation due to the dense fog. General Gregg himself, a veteran of the Mexican-American War known for his personal courage, rode toward the sound of guns to investigate. Tragically, as he approached the 13th South Carolina's position, he was struck by a bullet fired by Confederate troops from Archer's brigade. The ball entered his spine near his right shoulder, inflicting what would prove to be a mortal wound. The friendly fire continued for approximately 20 minutes before frantic staff officers managed to race between the units, confirming their identities and ordering a ceasefire. By then, significant damage had been done. Gregg's brigade suffered approximately 200 casualties, including their mortally wounded commander, while Archer's brigade lost nearly 150 men. These losses represented almost a quarter of the total Confederate casualties at Fredericksburg, a battle otherwise remembered as a resounding Southern victory. The incident's impact extended beyond the immediate casualties. The confusion temporarily disrupted the cohesion of Jackson's right flank, creating a potential vulnerability had Union forces managed to identify and exploit it. The loss of General Gregg, one of the Confederacy's most experienced and respected brigade commanders, represented a significant blow to the Army of Northern Virginia's leadership corps. Furthermore, the friendly fire incident damaged morale among the affected units, with soldiers expressing horror and remorse at having inadvertently fired upon their comrades. In the aftermath, both military necessity and Southern pride dictated how the incident would be reported and remembered. Official battle reports mentioned the friendly fire only obliquely, often attributing General Gregg's wounding to stray bullet or confused firing in the fog. Jackson's official report stated simply that, amid the changes of position and the obscurity caused by the fog and smoke, the 14th Tennessee and the 19th Georgia fired upon each other, without elaborating on the extent of casualties or disruption caused. Confederate newspapers focused on celebrating the overwhelming victory against Union forces, largely omitted mention of the friendly fire incident. When General Gregg died of his wounds on December 15, obituaries praised his service record and battlefield courage without specifying the circumstance of his death. This selective reporting helped preserve the narrative of Fredericksburg as an unalloyed Confederate triumph, unmarred by significant mistakes or self-inflicted wounds. Union intelligence did gather some information about the incident through prisoner interrogations and deserter reports. Major General Ambrose Burnside, the Union commander, learned of the Confederate confusion, but failed to capitalize on it. A missed opportunity that added to his growing list of tactical failures at Fredericksburg. The friendly fire at Fredericksburg offers insights into the fog of war that characterized Civil War battlefields. Despite the relatively small geographic scale of engagements by modern standards, communication challenges, limited visibility, and the chaos of combat frequently led to tragic mistakes. Similar incidents occurred in other major battles, including Chancellorsville, where Stonewall Jackson himself would be mortally wounded by friendly fire 5 months later. For the soldiers who survived the incident, the memory remained vivid long after official histories glossed over it. Lieutenant Wiley Moore of the 14th Tennessee later wrote in his memoirs, "The terrible mistake at Fredericksburg haunted many of us more than any battle against the Yankees. To know your own bullet might have struck down a brother Confederate was a burden hard to bear." Similar sentiments appear in letters and post-war accounts from South Carolina veterans, indicating the psychological impact lasted far beyond the battle itself. Modern battlefield archaeology has provided additional insights into the incident. Excavations in the 1990s uncovered concentrations of dropped and unfired Confederate ammunition in patterns consistent with troops hastily ceasing fire and clearing weapons. Physical evidence of the moment when soldiers realized they were firing on their own men. These findings have helped historians better understand the exact locations and sequence of events during those fog-shrouded morning hours. Today, the friendly fire incident at Fredericksburg serves as a poignant reminder of warfare's inherent chaos and tragedy. On a battlefield where Confederate forces achieved one of their most decisive victories, inflicting nearly 13,000 Union casualties while suffering fewer than 5,000 of their own. Hundreds of Southern soldiers fell not to enemy fire, but to bullets fired by their own comrades. This sobering reality underscores the truth that even in moments of tactical brilliance, the fog of war can exact a terrible and indiscriminate toll. A future U.S. president almost got court-martialed. In the annals of American presidential history, William McKinley's path from Civil War soldier to commander-in-chief represents one of the more remarkable journeys through the ranks. Yet his distinguished military career, which ultimately saw him rise from private to brevet major, nearly ended in disgrace during the bloodiest single day in American military history. On September 17, 1862, as the Battle of Antietam raged across the Maryland countryside, a 19-year-old commissary sergeant named William McKinley performed an act that simultaneously violated military protocol and demonstrated extraordinary courage. An act that could have ended his military career before it truly began, but instead became an enduring part of presidential law. McKinley had enlisted in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in June 1861, just 2 months after the firing on Fort Sumter. The regiment boasted other future notables in its ranks, including Rutherford B. Hayes, who would also become president, and Stanley Matthews, a future Supreme Court justice. Despite his youth and limited education, McKinley impressed his superiors with his intelligence, reliability, and attention to detail. These qualities earned him assignment as a commissary sergeant responsible for his regiment's food supplies, a role that, while unglamorous, was crucial to maintaining troop readiness and morale. By dawn on September 17, 1862, the 23rd Ohio had been engaged in heavy fighting for several days as part of the Maryland campaign. The regiment had already distinguished itself at the Battle of South Mountain on September 14, where they helped secure crucial mountain passes, allowing the Union Army to pursue Lee's forces. These engagements had left the men exhausted, hungry, and low on supplies as they moved into position along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, where the bloodiest battle of the war was about to unfold. As the morning progressed, the 23rd Ohio were to some of the most intense fighting around the area that would soon earn the name Bloody Lane, a sunken road that became a Confederate stronghold and the site of horrific casualties. By midday, the regiment had been engaged in combat for hours, with men falling rapidly to enemy fire and exhaustion. Their ammunition remained adequate, but the soldiers had gone without food since the previous evening, and hunger was becoming a serious concern affecting combat effectiveness. McKinley, stationed at the commissary wagons nearly 2 miles behind the battle lines, recognized the deteriorating situation. Without receiving orders but understanding the desperate need, he took an extraordinary risk. He directed the regiment's cooks to prepare hot coffee and food, loaded the provisions onto mule-drawn wagons, and personally led the small convoy toward the front lines, directly into the heart of the battlefield. The journey forward was perilous in the extreme. Confederate artillery had ranged the roads leading to the Union positions, and shells exploded regularly along McKinley's route. Snipers targeted anything moving toward the Union lines, while stray bullets from the main battle created a lethal hailstorm. Adding to the danger, the laden wagons presented large, slow-moving targets that attracted enemy fire. Several mules were hit during the advance, and at least one wagon was damaged by shell fragments. McKinley's decision violated standing orders that commissary personnel remain safely behind the lines, and for good reason. The potential loss of food supplies and trained commissary staff could impact an entire regiment's fighting capability for days. Furthermore, he had acted without authorization from his superior officers, technically an act of insubordination that could warrant severe disciplinary action. Under military law, McKinley had opened himself to charges of abandoning his post, endangering military property, and disobeying implicit orders, any one of which could result in court-martial proceedings. When McKinley and his wagons finally reached the forward elements of the 23rd Ohio, the initial reaction from the regiment's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, was one of astonishment quickly followed by anger. Hayes later recorded in his diary, "My first impulse was to rebuke him for coming to the front with food, when his proper place was with the commissary stores. But seeing the effect of his arrival with hot coffee and food on the men, who cheered him wildly and seemed suddenly reinvigorated, I recognized that his decision, while contrary to conventional military practice, had likely saved many lives through its impact on morale and fighting strength. That the impact of McKinley's arrival was indeed immediate and profound. Men who had been fighting on empty stomachs for hours received not just physical nourishment, but a powerful psychological boost. The hot coffee, a luxury in battlefield conditions, was particularly treasured by the troops. Several first-hand accounts from soldiers of the 23rd Ohio credit this timely arrival of provisions with giving them the strength to hold their position during subsequent Confederate counterattacks that afternoon. As the battle continued into the evening, McKinley remained with the forward elements rather than returning to the supply wagons, helping distribute provisions and even assisting with evacuating wounded soldiers. This continued presence at the front placed him directly in harm's way but further demonstrated his commitment to his fellow soldiers over strict adherence to military protocol. In the battle's aftermath, as officers reviewed the day's events, there was serious discussion about whether McKinley should face disciplinary action. Colonel Joachim Scammon, the brigade commander, initially intended to bring charges for abandoning his assigned position. However, Hayes interceded strongly on McKinley's behalf, arguing that the young sergeant's actions, while technically inappropriate, had materially contributed to the regiment's fighting effectiveness at a critical moment. The matter ultimately reached Major General Ambrose Burnside, commanding the Union's X Corps, who made a pragmatic decision that would change the course of McKinley's life. Rather than court-martial the young sergeant, Burnside concurred with Hayes's recommendation that McKinley instead receive a field promotion to second lieutenant for gallantry in battle. The promotion was dated September 24, 1862, just 1 week after Antietam. This battlefield promotion marked the beginning of McKinley's rise through officer ranks. He served with distinction throughout the remainder of the war, participating in major engagements including the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864 and earning promotion to brevet major by war's end. His Civil War service became a centerpiece of his later political campaigns, with the coffee incident at Antietam frequently highlighted as evidence of his practical leadership and concern for ordinary soldiers. After the war, McKinley studied law, entered politics, and began the slow climb that would eventually lead to the White House in 1897. Throughout his political career, he maintained close connections with veterans organizations, particularly the Grand Army of the Republic, where his military service lent him substantial credibility. The Antietam coffee story, repeated in campaign literature and speeches, helped humanize him to voters while emphasizing his courage under fire. McKinley's presidency would be defined by the Spanish-American War, territorial expansion, and ultimately his assassination in 1901. Yet his most profound personal crucible had come decades earlier on the blood-stained fields of Antietam, where a momentary decision to prioritize the immediate needs of fighting men over military protocol nearly ended his career before, instead launching it to greater heights. His near court-martial and subsequent redemption remain a testament to the fine line between military discipline and the practical necessities of battlefield leadership, a distinction that the future commander-in-chief learned firsthand in the cauldron of America's bloodiest conflict. There was a mummy in the war, among the countless strange and macabre stories to emerge from the American Civil War. Few are as bizarre as the tale of Old Jack, a mummified Confederate soldier who became a gullish sideshow attraction, traveling exhibition, and ultimately an enduring piece of Civil War folklore that blurs the boundaries between fact and fiction, respectful remembrance, and commercialized exploitation of the dead. The story begins not with a Confederate soldier named John Wilkes, but with a Union private named Thomas Holmes. Holmes had been fascinated by ancient Egyptian preservation techniques since childhood and had studied chemistry with a particular interest in preservatives and embalming compounds. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Holmes recognized both a patriotic duty and a professional opportunity. He volunteered his services to the Union Army, not as a fighting soldier but as an embalmer, a specialist who could prepare the bodies of fallen officers for shipment home to their families. Holmes arrived at this unique occupation at a pivotal moment in American funeral practices. Before the Civil War, embalming was rare in the United States, with most bodies being buried quickly after death to prevent decomposition. The few exceptions typically involved wealthy individuals or medical specimens preserved for study. The massive death toll of the war, combined with bereaved families' desires to see their loved ones one final time, created unprecedented demand for embalming services. Holmes was among the first to recognize and capitalize on this grim new market. Operating from a converted tent near major battlefields, Holmes developed his own embalming fluid, a proprietary mixture containing arsenic, zinc chloride, mercuric chloride, and various other toxic substances. He charged $100 to embalm officers, equivalent to approximately $3,000 today, and somewhat less for enlisted men, though few common soldiers or families could afford even reduced rates. By some accounts, Holmes personally embalmed over 4,000 Union soldiers during the war, earning himself the nickname the American Resurrectionist. The creation of Old Jack allegedly occurred after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. According to the most common version of the story, Holmes came upon the body of an unidentified young Confederate soldier whose features remained remarkably intact despite a fatal chest wound. Struck by the soldier's youth and serene expression, and seeing an opportunity to demonstrate his embalming skills, Holmes decided to preserve the body as a specimen even though no family had requested or would pay for the service. Using his most advanced techniques, Holmes drained the body of blood, replaced it with his preservative solution, and treated the skin with additional chemicals to prevent deterioration. The resulting mummy was remarkably lifelike, with facial features preserved in detail and even some flexibility maintained in the limbs. Holmes dressed the body in a clean Confederate uniform, positioned it in a glass-top display case, and gave it the nickname Old Jack, possibly a reference to Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Though the mummy represented a much younger man than the famous general, Holmes initially used Old Jack as an advertisement for his embalming services, displaying the mummy near battlefield embalming stations to demonstrate his preservation skills to potential clients. The reaction was mixed. Some officers were impressed by the technical achievement, while others found the display disrespectful or girlish. Military authorities tolerated the practice, recognizing the value of Holmes' embalming services for troop morale, as soldiers took comfort knowing their bodies would be preserved for proper burial should they fall in battle. As the war progressed, Holmes began charging curious onlookers a small fee to view the mummy. By 1863, the display had become a minor sensation among troops in the Army of the Potomac, with soldiers willingly paying 25 cents, about $5 in modern currency, for the macabre experience. Contemporary accounts describe mixed reactions. Some viewers were fascinated by the preservation techniques, others drawn by morbid curiosity, and many deeply disturbed by what they considered desecration of a fallen enemy. After the war ended in 1865, Holmes recognized the commercial potential of his unusual specimen. Rather than returning to his pre-war pharmaceutical business, he embarked on a new career as a traveling exhibitor. He constructed a specialized wagon with glass viewing panels and took Old Jack on tour through northern states, advertising the attraction as a rebel, preserved, or the embalmed soldier. The exhibition capitalized on both the public's continuing fascination with the recent conflict and Victorian-era interest in death and memento mori. Holmes' traveling exhibition proved surprisingly lucrative. In an era before radio, television, or cinema, live entertainment and exhibitions were in high demand, and Old Jack offered something uniquely sensational. The display typically appeared at county fairs, alongside circus sideshows, or in rented storefront spaces in small towns. Holmes supplemented the exhibit with educational lectures about embalming techniques, often selling bottled versions of his preservative compounds as household disinfectants, to generate additional income. The ethical questions surrounding the exhibition troubled some contemporaries. Veterans organizations occasionally protested the display, arguing it disrespected a fallen soldier who had never consented to such treatment. Several newspaper editorials condemned the practice as ghoulish exploitation. In at least 3 documented instances, local authorities ordered Holmes to leave town, citing public decency ordinances. However, such objections remained in the minority, as most communities accepted the exhibition as unusual but not fundamentally different from medical museums or anatomical displays common in the era. By the 1870s, the novelty had begun to fade, and Holmes sold the mummy to a succession of carnival operators and dime museum proprietors. Each new owner embellished the mummy's backstory, gradually transforming the nameless Confederate soldier into increasingly elaborate fictional identities. One exhibitor claimed the mummy was a spy executed by firing squad. Another promoted it as the preserved remains of John Wilkes Booth, despite the obvious physical dissimilarities with the notorious assassin. These fabricated histories increased public interest but further distanced the exhibition from any pretense of educational value or historical significance. The ultimate fate of Old Jack remains uncertain, with several competing accounts. The most widely accepted version holds that the mummy was destroyed in a carnival tent fire in St. Louis around 1892, leaving no remains to receive proper burial. Alternative accounts claim the mummy was eventually purchased by a medical school for anatomical study, or that it changed hands among private collectors into the early 20th century before disappearing from historical record. Modern historians view the saga of Old Jack as emblematic of America's complex relationship with Civil War memory and death during the conflict's immediate aftermath. The preservation and exhibition of an anonymous soldier's body reflected a society struggling to process unprecedented mass death, while also revealing the commercialization of wartime tragedy that began almost immediately after hostilities ceased. The mummy's transformation from anonymous casualty to revenue generating spectacle paralleled larger cultural patterns, as the actual Civil War gave way to manufactured memories, romanticized narratives, and commercialized versions of the conflict. Today, Old Jack exists primarily as a macabre footnote in Civil War history, occasionally referenced in academic studies of death customs or exhibition practices of the era. The story surfaces periodically in collections of Civil War oddities, though often with exaggerated details or conflated with similar historical incidents. While the factual details remain difficult to fully verify, after more than 150 years, the tale of the Civil War mummy continues to fascinate as a reminder of how quickly historical tragedy can transform into commercial spectacle, and how thin the line sometimes remains between memorialization and exploitation. The Civil War created America's first sniper unit. Burden's sharpshooters were one of the most unique and feared units in the Civil War. Unlike typical infantry regiments, which relied on mass volleys of musket fire, these soldiers specialized in precision shooting. They were handpicked for their marksmanship skills and were equipped with some of the most advanced rifles of the era. Their ability to eliminate high-value targets like officers, artillery crews, and enemy sharpshooters made them an invaluable asset to the Union Army. They were not just soldiers, they were the first snipers in American history, laying the foundation for modern sharpshooting techniques. The idea for a regiment of elite marksmen came from Hiram Burden, an inventor, engineer, and champion marksman. Burden was not a traditional military officer. He had no combat experience before the war, but he was a well-respected shooter and a man of vision. When the Civil War began, he proposed the creation of a unit composed entirely of the best riflemen in the North. His idea was ambitious. Instead of arming them with standard-issue muskets, these men would use highly accurate rifles and employ advanced tactics, including camouflage and long-range targeting, which were revolutionary at the time. President Abraham Lincoln, himself an admirer of sharpshooting, supported the idea, and Berdan was given permission to recruit his elite force. The selection process for Berdan's sharpshooters was rigorous. Unlike normal army recruitment, where physical fitness and basic firearm competency were enough, joining Berdan's regiment required exceptional skill. Candidates had to prove they could consistently hit a target at 200 yards, an extraordinary distance for the time, using their personal rifles. The test required soldiers to fire 10 consecutive shots within a circle just a few inches wide, demonstrating precision well beyond that of the average soldier. Thousands of men applied, but only a select few made the cut. These hand-picked marksmen were organized into the 1st and St. United States Sharpshooters, commonly known as Berdan's sharpshooters. One of the key advantages of Berdan's men was their superior weaponry. While the majority of Civil War soldiers used smoothbore or rifled muskets, which had limited accuracy beyond 100 yards, Berdan's sharpshooters were given state-of-the-art rifles. Many of them were issued Sharps rifles, which were breech-loading, meaning they could be reloaded much faster than traditional muzzle-loading muskets. Some also used custom-made target rifles, which were slower to reload but incredibly precise. The superior firepower of these weapons gave Berdan's men the ability to engage enemies from much greater distances than standard infantry. This forced Confederate officers and artillerymen to take cover, disrupting enemy movements and command structures. Berdan's sharpshooters were also pioneers in the use of camouflage. Unlike the standard blue uniforms of Union soldiers, which stood out against natural landscapes, Berdan's men wore distinctive green uniforms designed to blend in with trees and grass. This was an innovative approach to battlefield concealment, making them the first soldiers in American military history to wear what could be considered a dedicated sniper uniform. Their ability to remain hidden and strike from unexpected positions gave them a psychological advantage over their enemies, who often had no idea where the deadly shots were coming from. The first major test for Berdan's sharpshooters came in 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign, where Union forces attempted to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Here, the sharpshooters proved their worth by harassing enemy positions, targeting officers, and delaying Confederate movements. However, they truly made their mark at the Battle of Second Bull Run in August 1862, positioned in front of the main Union line. Berdan's men engaged Confederate forces in a deadly game of long-range marksmanship. Their accuracy disrupted enemy formations and allowed the Union Army to inflict significant damage before the main engagement even began. Despite the Union's eventual defeat in the battle, Berdan's sharpshooters gained a reputation for their effectiveness. One of their most famous engagements occurred at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. As Confederate forces attempted to take strategic positions around the battlefield, Berdan's men were deployed to key areas to halt their advance. On the second day of battle, the sharpshooters were ordered to eliminate Confederate troops positioned in Devil's Den, a rocky outcrop that provided excellent cover for enemy snipers. The sharpshooters engaged in intense duels with Confederate marksmen, using their superior rifles and camouflage to gain the upper hand. Later, they played a crucial role in disrupting Confederate movements on Little Round Top, where their precise fire helped slow down an enemy assault that could have broken the Union's defensive line. Beyond large battles, Berdan's sharpshooters were frequently used for specialized missions, such as destroying enemy artillery crews. Traditional Civil War combat relied heavily on artillery bombardment, and skilled sharpshooters could cripple enemy firepower by picking off the gunners. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, Berdan's men systematically eliminated Confederate artillery teams, reducing the effectiveness of the enemy's cannon fire. This was a game-changer in battles where artillery dominance often determined victory or defeat. Their ability to target and disrupt enemy logistics also extended to supply wagons and couriers, making them a constant thorn in the Confederacy's side. Despite their effectiveness, Berdan's sharpshooters faced challenges. Hiram Burton, though an excellent marksman and innovator, was not a great battlefield commander. He was known for being indecisive under pressure and often failed to coordinate his men effectively in large-scale battles. This led to frustration among his troops, many of whom felt they were not being used to their full potential. Additionally, Burton's insistence on bureaucracy and self-promotion created tension with higher-ranking officers, making it difficult for the sharpshooters to receive the support they needed. Eventually, Burton resigned his command, and the unit continued under different leadership. As the war progressed, the effectiveness of Burton's sharpshooters did not go unnoticed by the Confederacy. In response, the Southern armies began forming their own elite sharpshooter units, many of whom adopted similar tactics and equipment. While they were never as well organized or well equipped as Burton's men, Confederate sharpshooters became a formidable force, leading to intense sniper duels on the battlefield. By the end of the war, the legacy of Burton's sharpshooters was firmly established. They had played a key role in disrupting enemy operations, reducing the effectiveness of Confederate leadership, and proving that precision shooting could change the course of battles. The use of camouflage, long-range rifles, and unconventional tactics marked the beginning of modern sniper warfare. Today, military snipers use many of the same principles that Burton's men pioneered during the Civil War. After the war, many of the surviving sharpshooters went on to become respected figures in their communities. Some continued careers in marksmanship, while others applied their skills in law enforcement or hunting. Hiram Burton, despite his shortcomings as a commander, remained an influential figure in firearms development, designing new rifles and improving military technology. His contribution to warfare was undeniable, and his vision of a specialized sniper unit became a permanent part of military doctrine. Burton's sharpshooters were more than just soldiers with good aim. They were pioneers in a new form of warfare. Their impact on military history cannot be overstated, as they proved that precise, calculated shooting could change the outcome of battles. In a war often remembered for its large-scale clashes and brutal attrition, these elite marksmen demonstrated that sometimes a single well-placed shot could be just as powerful as 1,000 muskets. A Confederate general was killed by his own troops. During the Civil War, the Union Army attempted many unconventional tactics to gain an advantage over the Confederacy. One of the strangest and most ambitious ideas involved the use of hot air balloons for aerial reconnaissance. At a time when most battles were fought with limited visibility, and commanders relied on scouts and messengers for information, the ability to see enemy movements from the sky seemed like a game-changing innovation. The man behind this idea was Thaddeus Lowe, a brilliant aeronaut and scientist who had been experimenting with balloon flight before the war. He believed that balloons could provide a massive strategic advantage by allowing Union forces to observe Confederate troop movements from high above the battlefield. Lowe had been experimenting with balloon flight for years, making him one of the most accomplished aeronauts of his time. Before the war, he had even attempted to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a balloon, though the attempt was ultimately unsuccessful. When the Civil War broke out, he saw an opportunity to put his knowledge of flight to military use. In 1861, he demonstrated the effectiveness of balloon reconnaissance to President Abraham Lincoln by taking off from the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and sending a telegraph message from the sky. Lincoln was fascinated by the possibilities and approved the formation of the Union Army Balloon Corps, with Lowe as its head. The idea was that these balloons would be used to scout enemy positions, direct artillery fire, and provide real-time intelligence in a way that had never been done before. Lowe's balloons were made of silk and filled with hydrogen gas, allowing them to ascend thousands of feet into the air. From these heights, Union observers could see for miles, mapping Confederate positions and tracking troop movements. To communicate their findings, balloonists used signal flags and even a direct telegraph line that ran from the balloon to the ground, allowing them to send messages in real time. This was revolutionary at the time, as most battlefield communication relied on messengers traveling on horseback, which was slow and prone to errors. The balloons effectively turned the sky into a military observation post, giving the Union a distinct advantage in battles where information was crucial. The first major use of balloons in combat occurred during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, when Union forces attempted to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Low's balloons provided valuable intelligence, allowing Union generals to make better, informed decisions about troop deployments. In some cases, the balloons were even used to guide artillery strikes, with observers relaying adjustments to gunners based on where their shots landed. This was one of the earliest forms of aerial fire direction, a tactic that would become common in modern warfare. The Confederates, unaccustomed to dealing with threats from above, found themselves at a disadvantage as their movements were being watched and their positions mapped with unprecedented accuracy. Despite their effectiveness, the balloons also had significant drawbacks. One of the biggest issues was their vulnerability to enemy fire. While they were difficult to hit due to their altitude, Confederate forces soon realized that they could target the balloons while they were on the ground being inflated or moved. This led to instances where balloon crews were attacked before they could even get airborne. Additionally, operating the balloons required large amounts of hydrogen gas, which was difficult to transport and produce in the field. The logistical challenges of moving and maintaining the balloons often limited their use in fast-moving campaigns. Another issue was that balloons were highly visible, making it obvious when and where they were being used. Unlike modern spy planes or satellites, Civil War-era balloons had no way to conceal their presence, and Confederate forces quickly adapted by using camouflage deception and counter-reconnaissance tactics. In some cases, they would move troops only at night or under cover of trees to avoid detection. Confederate artillery units also tried shooting at the balloons, though hitting a moving target at such a high altitude was nearly impossible with the technology of the time. Nevertheless, the mere presence of Union balloons forced the Confederacy to change its battlefield strategies, proving that aerial reconnaissance could alter the way wars were fought. Low and his team continued their work throughout the early years of the war, but as time went on, the Balloon Corps faced increasing difficulties. One major problem was funding. Despite Lincoln's initial enthusiasm, the Union Army's leadership was slow to fully embrace aerial reconnaissance. Many traditional military officers were skeptical of balloons, seeing them as little more than a curiosity rather than a practical tool of war. Some generals refused to use them, preferring more conventional scouting methods. Without strong institutional support, the Balloon Corps struggled to maintain its operations, and Low often had to fight to secure the resources he needed to keep the balloons in the air. The decline of the Balloon Corps accelerated when Low himself left the program in 1863. Frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles and underappreciation from military leaders, he resigned from his post and returned to private life. Without its strongest advocate, the Balloon Corps slowly faded into obscurity. By the end of the war, balloon reconnaissance had largely been abandoned, as new military technologies and improved cavalry scouting reduced the need for aerial observation. However, the lessons learned from Low's experiments would not be forgotten. While the Union Army's balloon program was short-lived, its impact on military strategy was significant. The use of aerial reconnaissance demonstrated the value of gaining the high ground, even if that high ground was thousands of feet in the air. It was one of the first instances in history where air power played a role in warfare, paving the way for future developments in aviation and intelligence gathering. In later conflicts, aircraft would take over the role that balloons had pioneered, with aerial photography, reconnaissance planes, and eventually satellites becoming essential tools of war. The concept that started with Thaddeus Low's hydrogen-filled balloons in the Civil War would evolve into the modern practice of airborne surveillance and strategic air superiority. After the war, Low continued his work as an inventor and businessman, eventually becoming a wealthy entrepreneur. He remained involved in scientific research and engineering projects, but his contributions to military aviation were largely overlooked for many years. It wasn't until much later that historians began to recognize his role in shaping the future of aerial warfare. Today, he is remembered as one of the pioneers of military aviation, and his experiments with balloons are seen as a crucial step in the development of modern reconnaissance techniques. Though the Balloon Corps may not have lasted long, it represented a bold attempt to use the technology in ways that had never been tried before. In a war fought with muskets, cannons, and bayonets, the idea of spying from the sky must have seemed almost like science fiction to many soldiers. Yet, for a brief period, the Union Army had eyes in the sky, watching the battlefield from above and forever changing the way military leaders thought about information and intelligence. The Civil War was one of the last great conflicts fought before the advent of modern air power, but thanks to Thaddeus Lowe and his balloons, it was also one of the first to experiment with the idea of using the skies to gain an advantage over the enemy. The mysterious Phantom Army that saved Washington. During the early days of the Civil War, Washington, D.C., was in a precarious position. As the capital of the Union, it was a prime target for Confederate forces, and at times, it seemed dangerously vulnerable. In the summer of 1861, after the disastrous Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, panic spread through the city. The Union Army was in disarray, retreating in chaos, and many feared that Confederate forces would march straight into Washington. With little standing in their way, it seemed entirely possible that the war could be lost in a matter of weeks. However, something strange happened. Confederate scouts reported seeing large numbers of Union reinforcements gathering outside the city. But there was a catch. These reinforcements didn't exist. This bizarre event is sometimes referred to as the Phantom Army of Washington. The illusion that saved the capital was largely the work of George B. McClellan, the newly appointed commander of the Union Army. When he took command, he quickly realized that Washington was woefully under-defended. The city was supposed to be protected by a ring of forts and thousands of soldiers, but in reality, most of these defenses were incomplete, and the troops available were poorly trained. Knowing that a direct attack would be disastrous, McClellan resorted to an unusual strategy. He decided to make the Confederate forces believe the city was far better defended than it actually was. McClellan ordered a series of deceptive maneuvers to create the illusion of a massive Union buildup. He had his soldiers march in circles through the same areas, making it appear as though fresh reinforcements were constantly arriving. He also instructed his engineers to construct fake artillery positions, sometimes using logs painted black. These Quaker guns looked real from a distance but were completely useless in battle. Additionally, campfires were deliberately left burning at night, and tents were set up in vast numbers to make it seem as though the Union Army was far larger than it actually was. The goal was to create an intimidating spectacle, convincing the Confederates that Washington was an impenetrable fortress. The deception worked. Confederate spies and scouts relayed exaggerated reports of Union reinforcements gathering around the capital. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, who had commanded Southern forces at Bull Run, hesitated to advance further. Instead of pressing his advantage, he held back, convinced that attacking Washington would result in disaster. In reality, if the Confederates had launched an immediate attack, they might have taken the city before McClellan had time to properly organize his defenses. But the fear of an overwhelming Union force caused them to miss their opportunity. One of the most effective elements of the ruse was the strategic use of reconnaissance balloons. At the time, Thaddeus Lowe and his Union Balloon Corps were conducting aerial surveillance, sending balloons high above the battlefield to observe enemy movements. But McClellan turned this into another psychological weapon. By repeatedly launching balloons and ensuring they were visible to Confederate observers, he created the impression that Union forces were actively scouting for an impending battle. The Confederates, unaware of how small McClellan's actual forces were, assumed that the Union was preparing for a large-scale engagement. McClellan also understood the power of misinformation in the press. Newspaper reports, both real and fabricated, spread rumors of vast Union reinforcements arriving from the north. These reports made their way to Confederate spies, who in turn fed them to Southern commanders. In reality, no such reinforcements were arriving in large numbers. McClellan was still in the process of training and organizing his army, but by controlling the narrative and allowing misleading information to reach enemy ears, he bought himself precious time. Over the next few months, McClellan took full advantage of this delay to turn Washington into a fortress. He expanded and strengthened the defensive ring around the city, built additional fortifications, and trained his troops. By the time the Confederates realized the deception, it was too late. The Union defenses were now strong enough to repel an attack. The city that had once been vulnerable was now one of the most fortified locations in the country. The Confederacy had lost its best chance to strike a decisive blow against the Union. and McClellan had successfully bluffed his way into securing Washington. The psychological impact of the Phantom Army lasted beyond that summer. The Confederates remained wary of Washington's defenses, often overestimating Union strength based on McClellan's early tricks. Even after McClellan left command, the illusion of overwhelming Union numbers lingered, influencing Confederate decision-making throughout the war. While McClellan would later face criticism for his overly cautious approach in actual battles, his use of deception in the defense of Washington was one of his greatest strategic victories. This episode also highlighted an important lesson in military strategy. Perception is often as powerful as reality. The idea that an army could be deterred not by actual strength, but by the mere illusion of strength, demonstrated the power of psychological warfare. Military deception had been used throughout history, but McClellan's tactics during the Civil War were among the most sophisticated examples up to that point. His use of feigned troop movements, fake artillery, misinformation, and aerial reconnaissance laid the groundwork for future deception tactics in warfare. The Phantom Army of Washington remains one of the strangest yet most effective bluffs in military history. What should have been a disastrous situation for the Union was turned into an advantage through sheer trickery. McClellan, though often criticized for his later failures in the war, deserves credit for understanding that sometimes the mere appearance of strength is enough to change the course of history. If not for his deception, the Civil War might take a very different turn, one in which the Confederate flag flew over Washington, and the Union found itself fighting a much more desperate battle for survival.